Okay, let's go ahead and jump right in. Today, I'm going to be using a Copic .2 multiliner pen. Now, I like this pen because it draws with a nice thin line, but it also gives me a little bit of line variation. And it just depends on how much pressure I use. Okay, I'm going to first start my sketch like I do with all my other sketches, and that is simply to rough out the primary lines. And right here, I'm going to be focusing on trying to draw a tree that's going to be in front of my building. Now, I'm taking time to make sure that I've got my proportions correct as I draw out the rest of this building and the tree trunk. Now, if you've followed a lot of my videos, you'll know that I have a process that I tend to follow when I sketch, and that is simply to draw out my primary lines first. That is to say, I'm going to be blocking out the major lines of my building and other major elements in my scene first. Once I've done that, I will go back in and start adding all of the details, like the windows and doorways. But now, I want to talk about what I'm doing with this tree. As I draw the canopy of the tree, rather than just drawing one big blob shape, I'm starting to break up that tree into several smaller shapes. That's going to help me give a realistic look to that tree later, especially when I start to add the leaves. But for now, you can see that most of my sketch is a little rough and choppy, so I'm going to start to take this opportunity to go back in and refine some of those lines. You'll see me do this with the tree trunk as I go over the lines, and then I'll start to add some hatch lines to imply the shading around the tree branches. And I'll continue to refine those lines of the building in much the same way by going over them with my pen. Now, as I start to draw in some of the detail here, I'm just trying to focus on the major elements that stand out and draw very few lines, but as much as I need to get the impression of that detail, for example, of this window front here. Now, one of the things that I like to do is that I like to draw out the shadow shapes. I think this really kind of helps me later when I start to add shading, and it gives it a little bit of more interest to my scene. But for now, I'm going to focus on the right side of the building here and add the missing detail. I have a little plant down here that I'll add, and I'll focus on some benches. I do have a few benches that sit on the side of the building. I was going to not include them in my drawing, but the more I looked at it, the more I liked how they kind of stuck off the side and added a little bit more dimension to my scene. Okay, here I'm drawing those shadow lines for my tree, and I will continue to draw the shadow as it's casted onto the front of my storefront. Now, as I draw shadow lines, one of the things that I sometimes do and sometimes don't do is add hatch lines to my shadows. So you can see that I'm going to start adding some hatch lines to this sketch. If you look at my other sketches on the page, you may notice that you don't see a lot of those hatch lines in the shadows. This is something that I go back and forth with, but I really do like how the hatch lines appear in my sketches when I add them to my shadows. So that's what I'm doing here. And once I'm done with that, I'll move over to add more detail to this window on the side of the building. This window has a lot of reflections. I thought it would be nice to try to capture those reflections. I will build out those reflections a little more when I move over to my coloring, but for now, I'm just looking for major shapes that I can include to imply reflections in those windows. Okay, at this point, I will move over to my tree, and I want to talk a little bit about what I'm doing here to give that tree a little bit more texture and to bring it to life. I'm thinking about drawing several W's that are connected around those shapes, those initial shapes that I first drew. It's this W pattern that's going to give me the illusion of leaves, and I'm really just focusing on filling in the areas that I've laid out previously. Now, I'm keeping in mind that the light is probably coming from the top of my scene, so therefore a lot of my texture is going to be drawn toward the bottom of my shapes. At the same time, I know that the clumps of trees will either pop off the page, and there will be some areas of my tree that will recede into the page. And I'm going to suggest these receding areas with a few hatch lines. And this will also help me when I move over to coloring. I'll be able to use those areas to identify my shading quicker. And I will finish it up by adding a couple of stray branches with my pen. Now, I really enjoy sketching trees, and if you ever want a good tip on how to improve drawing, go to the park and look at the different types of shapes of trees and work on a quick 1-minute sketches on focusing on the tree's canopies. I'll continue to add a little bit of texture to my tree before I move over to the coloring. Now, I will be using the Copic Sketch alcohol markers to do my coloring, and I want to talk about the process that I'll be following for this sketch. As you can see, I've already started laying down my shadow colors. The first step that I'll be doing is a pass with a medium gray with all my shadows. Once I have the base shadows put down, I will move over to the colors, and then you'll see later that I'll add a final pass with another shadow color. As you can see now, I'm moving over to starting to add colors to my building face. I have a warm gray, and I'm just trying to find the tones in my building front to apply those colors. And you'll see me switch back and forth between different gray tones. And I'm focusing right now on the windows, trying to get that variation of color that will imply those reflections or that interest that I'm seeing in those windows. Now, my building does have an orange facade, so I am going to be building up that orange color slowly, and you'll see me do that over time. And one of the things that I want to point out about when I color is that I like to bounce around, and you'll see me do that here. I'll jump around to different parts of the scene, and I guess the only way I can describe that is that I'm not quite sure how to tackle maybe a certain color, so I'll give myself a break and find another area to color before I move on. And as you can see right now, I came back to that orange facade and decided to put on a darker orange. Now, this orange is a little bright, but we'll fix that later. And we're going to actually use the same technique to fix that orange facade as we do to fix this green in the trees. And that's exactly what I want to talk about right now, is the green that I'm putting down is a little bright and not exactly realistic. But as you can see here, I'm taking a warm gray to go back over those colors to mute that green. And then now it's just a matter of hitting up those shadow areas. I'm going to be applying gradually darker tones into my tree to get those areas to recede into the background and to make those green leaves pop more. Here I've grabbed a darker green that I'm using to hit some of those areas and also some of the undersides of those green shapes. And as I said earlier, I'll use that same technique to mute that orange facade. Now with a dark gray, I can fill in the benches, and I'll move over to the last stage, which is to add my final layer of shadows. Now, one of the tricks that I like to do with my shadows is to hit it with a nice dark blue color at the very end. And this just adds a lot of rich color into those deep shadows. And I really like this technique and how it's turned out lately. So that's what I'll be doing here, is just adding that dark blue to all of my shadow areas. And as you can see, it really does bring that color to life. And that's it. That's my final sketch. I really hope you've enjoyed this, and if you haven't already, please give it a like and subscribe.